Hedera is a battleship, very strong piece of equipment that is going to be there for 100-year vision. Pi is growing dramatically. If you have such a large addressable market, you need to have infrastructure that actually absorb that market. Hedera is uniquely positioned because of its scalability. As more adoption occurs from institutions, we're going to be in another phase. There's going to be a battle of the fittest, and Hedera is so well positioned. Next trillion transactions, they're coming from AI. They're going to be agentic in nature. They're going to be machine to machine. Human to human will always be there, but it will become less and less the way that we interact, because there will be this assistant to do this for me, buy this for me, generate yield for me. Hedera is leading on that front as well. We look at the world without borders, and it's being recognized by nation states globally. Hedera was recently selected to participate in an initiative with the Bank of England. There are the receptivity from nation states and from central banks. You have two institutions of very large scale that operate enormous businesses, and utilizing tokenized money market funds on Hedera. It's an enormous deal.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the All in Crypto podcast. I am your host, Rupert, and today I am delighted to be introducing a guest that I've wanted on the show for a while now. We've got Gregg Bell, the Chief Business Officer over at the Hedera Foundation, on the show. So welcome, Gregg. How are you?
I'm doing great. Excited to be here.
The pleasure is all mine. We were just saying off camera, it kind of feels like a pinch me, I'm dreaming moment for the cryptocurrency space with all the things taking place. We had the Fed sort of crypto conference yesterday, where the Fed Waller was very much outlining the kind of interwoven nature of the cryptocurrency space with the traditional financial system. It just seems like every day at the moment we get more confirmation in regards to where this space is heading. And I know you've known about this for a long time, and I'm sure we're going to get into it all. But where I want to start is with a little bit about yourself, Gregg. Kind of how you got to where you are today, and was there an aha moment on that journey in regards to the cryptocurrency space?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of what we're seeing today is now the intersection between traditional finance and crypto, right? That's really that aha moment where we're seeing more and more engagement from governments, from institutions that are now feeling that there is the regulatory clarity and the will within their organizations to engage, and that's really exciting. There's still a very small amount in the grand scheme of things that has been tokenized, both in terms of cryptocurrencies and native digital assets, as well as wrapped and tokenized financial products, and that's only growing. It's a one-directional train. Wallet users and the growth of the communities is growing. The wealth transfer from baby boomers is growing, and that is an exciting period in our industry, and I think in our lives, when there's this real transformation. Me personally, I started my career on Wall Street. I was an investment banker, both on the buy side as well as on the sell side, focused on securitization. So, structured products and tokenization were always how I sort of thought securitization would progress. And there's a lot of similarities in how you can use smart contracts to make things more efficient, in the same way that structured products were designed to alter cash flows, to create better risk profiles and new investment opportunities. And that's sort of the stage very much I think we're in, and what will be ahead of us as well. Immediately, I've been with the foundation now with HBAR Inc. for just about 2 years, or coming up on 2 years, and it's been an incredible community. The technology stack is unparalleled, and that's what really draws me to Hedera. And then you look at some of the differentiators of the network. Prior to joining the Hedera Foundation, I was at Binance on the US side, overseeing the listings, lending, and staking businesses. And when you're looking at asset issuers coming to you and saying, I would like to list this asset on the exchange, you see a huge breadth of various protocols. A
I
lot
believe
of
it.
them are, yeah, I mean, everybody wants to be listed on centralized exchanges for the liquidity. And you see a lot of commonalities, a lot of assets that are forks of other chains. You see a lot of assets that maybe are just a token and specific to one particular use case. Hedera is unique. Hedera is designed specifically for scalability. And that's so huge when there was so much conversations around the scalability of both Bitcoin and then of Ethereum. Um, being a unique consensus algorithm, being one that is designed from the ground up to be able to meet the needs of an individual and a Fortune 500 company and do so on a level platform, that's incredible. That is not seen that, and you see it proven in the way that Hedera has operated. So I know that's part of the reason why I'm here, and why I love this community.
Yeah, I always look at Hedera like a Swiss Army knife. It's just so capable. And I think when you sort of go down that rabbit hole of understanding what Hedera is capable of, and also sort of pairing that up with the direction the world is very obviously moving in. We talk about tokenization, we talk about the embrace of distributed ledger technology, whether it's to help prevent problems such as the one that arose with Amazon Web Services, or whether it's to give provenance to AI, or to fundamentally change money. Hedera really seems to be very fit for multiple purposes, not just one, and not just fit for it, very capable of doing so. So I think we,
Well,
we definitely,
it's
yeah,
providing that utility, right? If you as a user, you as a institution can directly see the utility or the benefit of this technology, then the adoption is only going to grow.
yeah,
Um, and I think in many ways, it starts with the financial aspect. When you have an asset that is on chain, it is a better form of collateral. That's something that I recognized very early in my career. So I, was the first to offer through a company that I co-founded a loan that was secured by digital assets, by cryptocurrency, by Bitcoin, Ethereum, Solana. Doge and others. And so the ability to have a asset that you can seize, liquidate, and trade in an always on market creates an incredible collateral form. And so what we're going to see is just an explosion of the purchasing power of individuals, the ability for us to take assets that are tokenized in all different forms and have them be collateral. Like that's a huge financial unlock. That unlocks capital in a way that is extremely powerful from an individual basis. And then you get the other solutions that you kind of just described in terms of how do you address trust problems. I love it when there's a trust problem. So often people say, "Hey, why does this need to be on a distributed ledger?" Well, if it is just addressing a trust problem, then it's an incredible tool to do so. And with AI, there are trust problems everywhere.
that could have huge ramifications if not solved for us as a species. It's we spoke with Dovu, and they're creating a kind of carbon credit market on Hedera. And one thing that we outlined was how Hedera kind of acts as that trust layer. Exactly that. The reason the carbon credit market has struggled for so long was because there wasn't that trust that the likes of Hedera can introduce. And you can't, or you don't just apply that to carbon credits. I mean, this can apply really to anything. It can apply to knowledge itself. And I really love the point that you brought up there. We're looking at financial instruments and how we can make them far more efficient. But actually, this doesn't just start and stop there. It goes into most things that are fundamental to our reality. And I think that this is the really cool thing about what this technology is doing. We're very sort of financial focused for very obvious reasons. Um, but it goes far beyond that. And I think that it's really exciting. And in order for it to go far beyond that, it needs to be capable enough to do so. And this is where I think Hedera really stands out. Also, talking about collateralized assets, and how sort of on chain assets are far more efficient. If you look at the 2008 financial crisis, I believe we're still trying to work that all out and piece that together. Could you maybe touch on that a little bit.
Yeah, transparency, auditability. I was on the buy side working at a very large multi-billion-dollar hedge fund during the financial crisis in the mortgage and collateralized loan
Wow.
obligation space. And so, we were moving assets from various prime brokers, including Lehman Brothers, and you were very subject to the timing of settlement, counterparty risk. You were very subject to locating securities. A lot of those risks are removed when you're talking about a always on 24/7 market that has the auditability of on-chain markets. Now, what we saw, of course, you mentioned the AWS outage that occurred recently, right? Here is an example where you have centralization, and um, many industries have been exposed to this. There was, the core banking functionality was offline. Airline functionality in terms of the bookings and was offline. You saw social media that was offline. So huge disruption to industries globally. And I think that's a wake up call, right? That's a wake up call for alternative to centralized models, such as distributed ledgers that can provide a more robust experience. That doesn't mean that there's not cost to change, to onboard to a new technology. There are, but it comes with immense benefits. And sometimes those benefits aren't really felt until you experience the pain or the loss of revenue or the loss of functionality as a user when you have a blackout, when you have an outage. And that can be challenging. It can also be systemically risky, right? When we talk about the great financial crisis, that was global systemic financial risk. Now, if all financial providers are dependent on infrastructure that is also equally centralized, you have risk that can be from a variety of, whether it's war or natural disaster or a glitch, like outages that are centralized can be really, really damaging to an economy. And I think the actions of one individual or one party from an economic perspective to say, all right, I'm going to choose like the easiest or most low cost alternative in terms of a cloud service provider, that can make sense in the individual capacity. But when it's collective and you have lots and lots of people or institutions that are choosing that same decision, then you have a bottleneck. And that's also true with the blockchain industry. What we saw was that not all protocols were unscathed by this event. Hedera was unscathed. It's a testament to the structure of Hedera being as decentralized in terms of the infrastructure on all continents, excluding Antarctica, on
For now.
hardware and cloud service providers, in industry distribution. It is very thoughtful. The way that the governing council operates. When people think about the governing council as sort of those that govern, yes, they do make decisions around the network, but they also physically are operating hardware. And that is unique. Where we saw a variety of layer twos that went down. That's unfortunate, of course. Um, Sandeep from Polygon made headlines the other day, and he actually called out Hedera, and he called saying that Hedera as a layer one was valued higher than Polygon and Arbitrum and Optimism and Scroll combined. And these all happen to be the same networks that had outages, including Base and Lena, and largely due to the centralized exposure to individual platforms. And so you can have thousands of nodes, but to assume that thousands of nodes actually results in the the improved performance and decentralization of a network is false if they all exist on common platforms. And in most cases, AWS as a cloud service provider actually wasn't even the number one cloud provider. There are other cloud providers that if had gone would have had far worse outcomes for the outages across these networks. So, you can see where unfortunate events can actually drive the differentiation between various chains and what enterprise grade really means, what the value is in robust, redundant, distributed networks like Hedera that you don't have to sacrifice performance for decentralization. And I think that with layer twos, many cases they've been a band-aid for the inability for these various layer ones like Ethereum to scale. And Hedera has that proven scalability. Right, going back to the list we were previously discussing, Hedera also has greater transaction throughput than all of those networks combined, proven. Uh, so it's unfortunate when you have these types of events globally, but when the tide goes out, there's a saying that you see who's not wearing pants
Who's
or
swimming
shorts,
naked?
swimming
Yeah,
naked, right? Hedera uh, is a battleship, is a very strong piece of equipment that is going to be there for days to come, years to come. The 100-year vision.
100-year vision. I absolutely love that, and the word that I really want to pick up on is thoughtful. This is a project that's just been unbelievably well thought out. You talk about Byzantine fault tolerant. You talk about these kind of things that, I mean, even BlackRock in their ETF filing had put in the provisions now for if people lose money as a result of quantum computing, they're kind of null and void from being responsible for that. Whereas this is stuff Hedera's thought about years
They're thinking
before.
about, yes, it's incredible. I mean, they're thinking about the issues that these networks will have to face in the future, like quantum
Yep.
resistance and being post-quantum ready. They're thinking about the needs of ensuring that there is the throughput, the uptime, the governance, the decentralization. Where does Hedera really differentiate itself? One of the areas I think is the predictable fees. Um, but oftentimes that decision is decoupled from the why. Why do nearly every single other blockchain or network out there have surge pricing models? Why do they have surge pricing that are Uber and Lyft style models, but they're not small percentages? These are 1,000, 2,000x increases in fees. And they come at points when there is network congestion. They are economically designed to decrease the transaction volume because these networks cannot scale to adopt that transaction throughput. Hedera can. And so there is no need for a perverse economic incentive to say when everybody wants to transact, you have to pay more. When there's high volatility and your assets are being margin called and you're trying to move assets from one place to another and they're not going through because there's congestion or because the network goes down or all of a sudden you're being charged an arm and a leg for a transaction that should be 1 cent, like that's not a good user experience and that's not how you onboard mass scale users.
Yeah. Yep, absolutely. I remember showing my accountant my transaction fees that she had mistaken for me buying something. And I said, no, that's just a transaction fee to actually use this network. It was to unstake something on Ethereum. And she was like, is this not supposed to be the future of finance? And I kind of remember thinking, she's got a really good point there, actually. Whereas Hedera, and you bring up the point about extraction, there has long been echoes or rumors or I don't know what perhaps the right word would be in regards to networks actually, like you say, deliberately putting these things in place to throttle the network and actually extract in many ways. Some of these were, instead of mistakes,
By
designed
design.
features. Yeah,
Sure.
absolutely.
Well, that's where you have hedge funds that have the focus or strategy specifically for maximum extractable value.
Yep.
Another feature that doesn't exist within Hedera because it's not a good feature, right?
Yep.
Hedera is built for global finance. To enable front running within the underlying protocol itself is a terrible idea. And I think that there will be, that doesn't position it what a network or a technology stack well for the adoption of existing financial products because front running is illegal activity in
Yep.
most regulated markets and you're embedding it directly within the settlement infrastructure. That's
Yeah.
just not good. So this is where the governance model and the benefit of having investment banks like Nomura and asset managers like Aberdeen on the governing council of Hedera is not just that these are huge institutions and they're Fortune 500s and they're running the infrastructure and enabling that uptime and scalability enterprise grade, but it's also the foresight to think about how you structure a technology that can actually absorb the needs of a global financial system and do so with similar safeguards.
Yeah. How can enterprises, if you look at, I know when 21 Shares sort of launched their ETP, and of course we've had Duncan on the show a number of times now. They sort of positioned it or named it as the kind of enterprise grade DLT. And I think if you look at the other distributed ledgers out there, for some of the reasons like the one we've just spoken about, they can't really be used practically for any kind of scalable enterprise use case. Whereas Hedera, thoughtful is the perfect word for it, I think. And that doesn't do it justice. Greg, I want to take us back to
Well, but
tokenization. Yeah,
before you move on to that
sure.
from that, because I do think, I believe that there, as more adoption occurs from institutions, we're going to be in another phase at some point where protocol wars might not be the right term, but ultimately there's going to be the testing of a variety of different protocols, because no institution is out there that really wants to say, I'm choosing the winner. And so they choose a number of different protocols, but then they're testing them, and things like the experience, the ability to meet their compliance obligations or their regulatory obligations. Like, we didn't even touch about the fact that in most public networks, the node validation can occur within a sanctioned country. That's an OFAC violation, which is a sort of a sanctioned violation in the U.S. So there's a lot of sort of these infrastructure things that will play out, and as global institutions adopt blockchain technology broadly, there's going to be a battle of the fittest, right? And Hedera is so well positioned because of just the robust nature of the governance, the infrastructure, the technology stack. It's gonna be
I
fun.
do I do think one thing that I often think about was if you look at why many protocols have decided to build, let's say, on Ethereum or some of the other chains, it's really due to the network effect that they have, due to perhaps liquidity that is on those chains, and they look to take advantage of communities and things like this.
Mhm.
And I think that once there's a kind of interoperability problem that's been solved, you won't need to actually stay in one siloed ecosystem. And then it kind of becomes okay, what's the most efficient chain to get the job done? And I think when you see that, Hedera just becomes so obvious. I mean, whether it's the fixed fees, whether it's the governance model, whether it's
Mhm.
to go back to, and I know we've just
Well,
covered
a
this.
computer, an AI is going to make that decision for us, and they're
Yeah.
not gonna be influenced in the same way by, crypto Twitter, uh,
Yep.
or awareness, right? The awareness of LLMs of various infrastructure opportunities is going to be at a very, very high level, and we're already seeing that when you query LLMs in terms of differentiate this from that, like, they can get very, very granular.
Yep. And this is, yeah, I think when this sort of, when you start to look at the facts, when you start to look at, okay, the practical usage of this, Hedera is just head and shoulders, in my opinion. I mean, this is when I went down the rabbit hole, and I've been in the sort of DLT space in regards to some capacity since 2012, since the days of Silk Road, and have sort of followed it forwards as an observer of what sort of took place there. And I kind of came to a point where I was like, I followed many protocols, and I came to a point where I kind of went, okay, just looking at these in terms of what they can do, what they're capable of, what the kind of model is behind them. Hedera just all of a sudden just started to leave everything behind in terms of capabilities, and I think, that's why we're so zealous about it as we are as a kind of channel, as a media outlet, because we just think it's a winner in many regards. Greg, I want to get us
Well, that's
back to
our role. That's part of the role of
sure.
the foundation, is to grow the awareness of the technology, and that's, part of the reason why I love my job is, it's quite simple. I'm here to help,
Yep.
right? I'm here to help anybody that wants to build on Hedera, whether that's an individual or an institution, and grow the awareness. And when you have a really good product, It's a lot
Yep.
easier and more fun to be able to bring the awareness of that product to the masses.
For sure, and I think you've been doing a great job of it. You know, we've watched you, whether it was at Sibos, wherever it
Well,
was, and yeah,
likewise, this show has been incredible in terms of bringing our message broadly.
and I share that with you. You know, when you're talking about something like Hedera, which is the real McCoy, as it were, it's very easy to talk about it because you don't need to make anything up. It's all there, you know, and you just need to say the facts, and people can do with that what they want. And I think when they get those facts, they'll make a kind of decision on it accordingly. Let's go
There's
back.
a lot of people that go and they're like, I don't know enough about Hedera, and then what's going on in this network, and then they start to look under the hood, and they're
Yep,
totally blown away. And you mentioned interoperability, and I just want to
for
double
sure.
click on that for a second, using a consulting term, but you know, the interoperability today between different blockchains, that's important. It is, but that is not actually what is going to drive this industry forward. It's the interoperability with traditional
Yep.
financial instruments, financial cash movements, and financial settlement or custody infrastructure. That's going to change everything.
Yeah, and we're seeing the start of that. You know, I know we're going to probably get into what Archax, Aberdeen, and Lloyd's Banking Group conducted. I mean, this is I can't believe that there wasn't, again, talk about biases in the cryptocurrency space. I can't believe there wasn't more coverage of this because this is no small sort of feat. This is monumental. I mean, it was a first of its kind, addressing a kind of market or playing in a market. The UK has a lot of grace given to it due to its financial markets. It accounts for nearly half of all FX trades globally. And I mean, Hedera is playing an active role in innovating that entire industry, which is very interesting. Let's get back to tokenization. Greg, could you perhaps outline the big picture here in regards to tokenization? There's lots of different things that can get tokenized, but in regards to financial instruments, we spoke a little bit about the efficiencies. What's the kind of big thing that's happening? Are we looking at a kind of evolution as a whole for financial products, financial instruments, you know, assets from the way that they're currently operated? So, for example, you have literally, I think DTCC is accountable for 95% of all US securities. And they came about because they needed that consolidation, right? Whereas now we're at a stage where, I mean, if there was ever an issue there, and they're quite efficient as it is, it could be a real problem like Amazon Web Services. But what's the big picture in regards to what's happening here with tokenization?
Yeah, so the big picture is this migration from a account structure, like a bank account or a securities account, to wallet infrastructure. And that's the migration that individuals have done, right, in terms of their self-custodial wallets. But that's what institutions are beginning to do. And when you have an institution like the DTCC or Euroclear or big investment banks or big custody platforms of traditional assets that have trillions of dollars in custody, that migration can change the volumes that you see in tokenization overnight. Today, although the industry is really excited about the progress that has occurred, and we see on Hedera examples like Red Swan, the broker dealer, they just tokenized the very first building on the skyline of Manhattan, right? That's huge. That's going to be a landmark. The hotel in Rivington and tokenized on Hedera, but it's still singular asset in nature. These platforms will enable entire asset classes. It's not going to be, hey, we're enabling this security and that security. It's going to be, we enable all equities in one fell swoop. We enable all debt products. It's that's how uh, incredible the adoption of some of this infrastructure will be. Now, that doesn't mean that it all automatically converts, but what you will have is this parallel account structure of a bank account or a securities account and a wallet. And the assets that you hold in your wallet will at some point in the not too distant future, be able to hold all of your financial instruments, and they can be packaged, they can be pooled. So, you mentioned Artract. One of the innovations that they've done is terms of the pooled token. This is structured products, right? This is taking a number of different tokens that could represent a number of different things. Like today, they were money market funds from BlackRock and from Aberdeen and from Legal and General and State Street, and pooled into one individual token. But you can easily see this being HBAR in a money market fund, or Bitcoin in a money market fund, or title to some property or an investment in real estate. You can combine your 401k into one individual security. I don't know if you've ever gone through in the U.S. They have retirement funds that are held within these various walled gardens, and you have the ability as an individual to move it around. Maybe they have something similar in the UK,
Yeah, yeah,
but
yeah.
it's really challenging to move because you have to sell all your assets, revert to cash or to fiat. You get a physical check mailed to you. You have 90 days to redeposit that into a new institution and rebuy your portfolio. You don't
Wow.
have to do that anymore. And you have to get medallions and notaries and stamps and different things. Like, that's all out the window. That's archaic. And so having a individual customized risk portfolio, like your own ETF, your own mutual fund, your own portfolio, your retirement fund that you can transfer around, um, create new risk, use as collateral, like that is extremely innovative. And to be able to do that for fractions of the cost
Yeah,
is part of the innovation.
I think when Paul Atkins, who's obviously over at the SEC now, said there's a new era for financial markets underway, this is exactly what he's talking about. Kind of financial assets are going from being sent via the postal service to email. And actually, far more than that. That doesn't even do it justice. You're creating
No, because it's
entirely
logic
new.
based. Yes, it's logic-based email, and I had a closed door meeting with him not so long ago, and he's very much a forward thinker and understanding where this technology is headed, and similarly concerned around the risks that technology can pose to the financial system, and so whether that's the centralization as it relates to what we discussed earlier with the AWS outage,
Yep.
or ensuring that there is client and investor protections in place. And that's
Yeah.
where Hedera really has thought a lot about a lot of these risks.
Yeah, it's always sought to be, another thing, just to sort of, as a credit to Hedera, was the initial sort of spawning of this industry was really to go against the financial system. For a while there was a vision of this sort of new system living externally to the regulated one, that is the standard. And actually now it's very apparent, and Hedera's had this vision in mind in regards to being, KYC, AML compliant, all of these things. It's sort of built in regards to, look at the tokenization studio, you look at the stablecoin studio, so on and so forth. Hedera was really very early on that in terms of understanding that actually, look, this technology is fundamentally going to revolutionize the world as we know it. Yes, it will create entirely new worlds. We talk about tokenization. There's a lot of wealth out there that there's no perhaps financial products around, that as a result of that, developing nations lose out on. We spoke
Global
with Red Swan.
Yeah,
Yeah.
global access is incredible. Providing the ability for new individuals, new access to markets that were otherwise unable to be achieved. That's a huge innovation. We look at the world without borders. Technology doesn't have lines in the sand around where one country ends or one country begins, and so that's a real value add. Um, and it's being recognized by nation states globally. I know Hedera was recently selected to participate in a initiative with the Bank of England. There are the receptivity from nation states and from central banks and consortiums of banks and large investment banks is is there. It's very palatable. And they're eager to educate themselves. They're eager to understand how they can provide new services. And for the longest time, like, banks were not trusted. There were surveys after surveys after surveys that were like, banks generally were one of the most that had some of the lowest trust scores. And what do blockchains and DLTs provide as a way to embed trust in relationships to address trust problems? And so I don't think that sort of the libertarian bent that you were sort of describing earlier is necessary, or like the anti-bank was part of that. Is the root well, like, what's the root cause? It's the lack of trust. Like, if there was greater accountability, greater access to your investment, greater autonomy or sovereignty, uh, some of these some of that lack of trust wouldn't be there.
The sort of Bank of England isn't the only sort of central bank that is looking into Hedera and its technology. Obviously, you've got the Reserve Bank of Australia. Obviously, Rob's doing some amazing work over there. You know, he really is pioneering. There's this kind of, before we get on to maybe a global arms race in regards to adopting this technology, because it's in every country's and every corporation's best interest to actually do this due to the efficiencies that it unlocks. And I do want to touch on that. But talking about sort of going back to that, talking about kind of tokenization in regards to like developing nations, you know, we interviewed Ed at Red Swan just the other day. It's coming out tomorrow, actually, or it might already be out, depending on when you're watching this. We also interviewed Swarms. And one thing that we spoke about was the reach that tokenization can give to the world. It kind of takes away those borders, as it were, as you put it, in regards to these financial products. And not only that, you can create entirely new financial products, actually elevating the world. Like this technology is unbelievably impactful. And when you think about developing nations that
It's
may not have been
empowering.
able,
It's
empowering is the correct
empowering.
word. Yeah.
It creates um, the potential for increased purchasing power, right? What do people really want? When you boil it down, it's the ability to buy the things they want in life, right? From a financial perspective, and the things they want or need. And when you have things that you've purchased that you've locked capital up in, and now they are tokenized, now they can be, you can tap into that asset and borrow against it because it is a new collateral form, whether that's traditional, like right now we're going through the traditional assets that are already collateral forms, like equities, like real estate. Um, but it's already has expanded beyond that. Just look at Bitcoin, right? A new digital asset that is a collateral form, right? HBAR, same deal, right? A new digital asset that is collateral form. So you can, the ability to improve the quality of life of people through access, through uh, enabling greater trust and transparency and auditability, and enabling greater purchasing power. That's where we are. That's really exciting, and that's,
Yeah.
I think, why so many
Empowering.
people are this. Yeah, it's interesting.
Empowering.
It's mm,
Is the absolutely correct world. And I think, you know, I looked at what Christine Lagarde had to say about an unlock for Europe, um, and the kind of European nations through this technology. I mean, she specifically said through embracing this technology, we can actually increase GDP.
yes.
The Bank of England actually released a paper saying a similar thing a while ago. And I think I'm almost asking you to be a bit of an economist here, but I think with technologies, you get uh, unlocks to the world and kind of growth. I mean, if you look at the shipping container, shipping before that was a nightmare. You introduce a shipping container, you had a 700% sort of increase in shipping globally. Do you think we're looking at some sort of like an economic boom as a result of? Because I do, I very much do.
Yeah, I mean, commerce can occur globally at the speed of the internet in a programmable way. One of the areas that I really love is supply chain and the ability to have, you know, factoring or tokenized invoices that can take global shipments and enable the period of time that a payment occurs from invoice to payment from, 120 days or 90 days down to, more delivery versus payment type of settlement. Like, that is a huge unlock and one of the key areas of focus for the supply chain initiatives on Hedera. And that's a huge area of many of the governing council members, they're take Aero Electronics as an example, like electronics company, but supply chain is a huge component of their business. You take Mondelez, right, maker of Oreo cookies. Globally, supply chains are a huge component of their business. So, to the extent you can unlock and provide benefit to entire segments of the economy, it's going to be a huge boom.
Not just to mention bring people into the global economy. I mean, is it something like 2 billion people don't even have access to basic financial sort of instruments, or what's going on here is it's kind of like the internet, right? When the internet first came about, it's kind of like and not, but when the internet first came about, nobody really probably envisioned we'd be using it in the way that we are. And I think distributed ledgers there's so much sort of unlocking. I think some people would be rather upset at the fact that a large part of the usage of the internet is just scrolling on whatever it may be, looking at cat memes. But the adoption's adoption, right?
Well, that's
I'm
the
just
equivalent of meme coins, I guess, within our
great
industry.
example.
But you can't deny the benefits, and governments are waking up to this. They're interested in various tokenized stable coins
Yep.
or land registries or title, right? They're looking at CBDCs. They're looking at how to improve their economies that are in many ways walled off from global capital markets.
Yep. And the systems that go around actually enabling that. You talk about sort of registrations and things like this. I mean, a lot of this just hasn't been possible until you get this kind of trustable thing. And actually, the beautiful thing about DLTs is you can actually implement privacy where it's needed. And this is a whole area that we could spend a whole sort of interview just talking about how DLTs can actually provide sovereignty to individuals through things like whatever apparatus it may be, zero knowledge, whatever it may be. Greg, let's talk a little bit about what Hedera. We've spoken about a number of things, but let's talk a little bit about what Hedera is doing today in terms of tokenization. It could be the Wyoming stablecoin. It could be the Reserve Bank of Australia. It could be what Archax are doing. I mean, there's just so much. Maybe you could bring up highlight a few things that Hedera is currently doing today in the realms of tokenization.
Yeah, so I think there's two sort of areas. One is on the payment side, and one is which is largely stable coins. Those are units of account. They're being selected by the state of Wyoming for its FRNT stablecoin is a huge deal. This is a state issued stablecoin, the first in the United States. For there's more stablecoin initiatives globally occurring than I think are even in the news. Everybody knows this is coming, but it's very, very real. Um, and then you have the financial instruments, and to me, the most exciting are those that actually are also enabling stablecoins. So cash flows or other distributions. They're not isolated. A lot of the tokenization of securities that has occurred today has been more isolated in that it's a representation of ownership of a digital ID or a twin of sort of a receipt of ownership. It's not the plumbing or mechanics of the cash flows and all the ancillary data that is associated with that security. This is one of the differentiating things about Hedera actually, is that Hedera has a a service that enables the attestation of data and the trust of data to be associated with that digital identity. So you can think of it as sort of there's a nucleus, which is that digital identity or twin, or maybe it's the title to your house or land registry in some jurisdiction. And then there are a whole bunch of attestations or notaries that occur to say, well, yes, this is you know Rupert's property. It's been verified by an insurance company. It's been verified by the state. It's how you take a traditional asset and actually bring it on chain. You can't just individually do it. You have to have a whole bunch of different data points, converging validity, right? Multiple points that go and stamp and say, yes, now that it exists. And once it exists, then it can move more freely and become a collateral form. So title becoming a collateral form, enabling mortgage markets in countries where there isn't a robust capital markets for a property, that unlocks and enriches a population in a way that no other financial innovation can really accomplish, because all of a sudden you have people that have an asset, and usually a home is everybody's largest asset, and they can tap into that. That's incredible, and that will be Um, we've experienced that in Western countries, but there are huge pockets of the world that have not, and largely it's because lenders have a difficult time trusting the the information as it relates to the title, the security of the asset, the ability to implement, their various legal jurisdictions. Um, it doesn't solve every problem, but it solves a hell of a lot of them.
Yeah, and I mean the money that's associated with those processes is just unbelievable. I mean, you look at, and I know we're talking about financial instruments here, but I've got a family member that's in the music industry, and he speaks about the kind of record keeping that goes on with like deeds to records or music or whatever it may be. And in many cases, you have to physically go to an office to try and sort of get something through. And it's just like, why are we doing this? This
Right.
is
Auto-
2025.
Automated distributions through smart contracts, having royalties that are embedded, that are enforceable. I think with a lot of the NFT wave that we previously had in this industry, there was the lack of understanding around different enforceability of the actual royalties. Um, Hedera's royalty structure is embedded into the asset. And so you can't sort of circumvent it as you can with other networks. And so I think it's really well suited for those types of functionality where you have a, a creative asset, music, art, otherwise, that will pay royalties to holders or creators throughout their life of that asset, which could potentially be for uh, generations to come, and have that enforced in a binding contract without having to, yeah, as you said, take your certificate of ownership to the recording studio or the record label and say, hey, um, I'm owed X.
And if you think about, we're talking about booms here. You talk about those industries, the kind of content industry, perhaps. Not just the kind of art industry. You talk about like social media content. You talk about things like this. It just creates this entirely new economic model for industries that perhaps haven't quite caught up with where they should be. And I think this is an aspect. We're talking about financial products, but actually the abilities that Hedera has to fundamentally change the world as we know it at a time when the world is changing. You talk about AI. One of my favorite charts at the moment is US job openings and the S&P 500. And you have the introduction of ChatGPT. So US job openings have typically followed the S&P pretty well. Jobs, you know about this stuff far better than I do. But you introduce ChatGPT and you find that job openings have gone like this, they've gone down, and the S&P's gone up. And it's kind of bucked a long-standing trend due to the introduction of AI and technologies. And I think that's a great representation of a changing world and a need for a changing economy in a digital world. And I think if you think about the agricultural revolution, when that came around, people would have been going, oh no, we're going to lose our jobs. And in many cases, people did lose jobs, but there was new economic models that were enabled by that technology because people didn't have to be on the fields
Oh
picking
yeah.
carrots, you
Think
know?
about the number of people that are, probably list their profession as an Uber driver today. And
Yeah.
that did Uber exist 10 years ago or 12 years ago? I don't, whenever. It's relatively new. This industry, we didn't, this industry wasn't envisioned when I was in high
Yep.
school or college, and here we are. And so there is the adaptability. I'm a believer in societal's ability to adopt new tools, um, to be able to access a an expert, right? And AIs have the ability to be sort of a army of experts next to you that can help advise. Now you have to trust the advice, and that's where right now we know there are deep fakes, we know there's hallucinations, we know that there are so many areas where there is a lack of transparency. It's sort of like in elementary school, or school you had to show your work. Just writing the right math solution wasn't enough. You had to show the equation. um, that's where regulation is going to continue to point. It's prove the compute verified, the audit trail of any output. And Hedera has been leading on this front in terms of being able to embed a verifiable compute component into NVIDIA and Intel chips through Equity Labs and through Prove AI is similarly looking at this problem. And it's how do you trust the output? And it's really important when you in certain industries. Like I would expect the first adopters to be in defense, to be in healthcare, to be in financial markets, where a hallucination could mean a life
Lives.
or death. It could
Yeah.
mean a huge financial impact. And so, yeah, that's quite exciting.
Yeah, and this sort of gets to maybe the root of what Hedera, you talk about Hello Future. There's a kind of motto out there. It's very fitting for Hedera. It's kind of, we talk about all of this stuff. This has to be enabled by something. Hedera is that something, I think, in many cases. And I think that's really, really exciting. If you look at the people that play a major role, talking about Amazon Web Services in the world as we know it, think about how many businesses were affected by that. We've spoken about how Hedera moves away from that centralization. With decentralization, you can combat that. But that's a multi-trillion-dollar company because of how the role that it plays in our world. I think when you think about the role that Hedera is going to play in tomorrow's world, it kind of, again, I don't even think I can comprehend it, but I can understand certain areas that it may play a real role. And I think going back to sort of financial products, Greg, what did you think about what Archax, Aberdeen, and Lloyd's banking group did? I mean, this is a big deal.
Oh, it's an enormous deal. The fact that you have a a a example here that is live and ongoing, that you have two institutions of very large scale, right? That operate enormous businesses. As you mentioned, that the FX business is within the London markets are one of the largest in the world, if not the largest in the world, and finding ways to have there be improved counterparty risk, enabling intraday settlement of exposure that one firm has to another for its FX business, and utilizing tokenized money market funds on Hedera to provide the ability to remain invested and reduce that risk is a real world economic reason for deploying this technology. And that's really exciting. I think we're going to see a lot more of that. They are at the cutting edge, and there's going to be the message here is that the pie is growing dramatically, right? And so you can see it on all the various use cases. But if you have such a large addressable market, uh, you need to have infrastructure that can actually absorb that market. Um, what we will see is that there, in fact, are few blockchains that can. And so I do think there will be specialized markets. You'll see certain protocols that will be like, we're going to specialize in this particular industry that might be more accommodative to their platform. But as a layer one, Hedera is uniquely positioned because of its scalability. And I'm not talking about sharding and all the horizontal, but vertically scalable, and doing so without requiring the band-aid of a layer two, with its centralized components, which we've all just seen are in sometimes a less than ideal solution for a user.
Yeah, a band-aid, as it were, and it only takes for that band-aid to get a bit wet, or to have a bit of an issue, or to have been on there a little bit too long for there to be problems with it, to use an interesting analogy. So, Greg, looking ahead, I mean, we could really do an entire podcast on each one of these topics, and we really would love to get you back on as many times as we possibly can, because you are truly a wealth of knowledge when it comes to all of this. Looking ahead for the rest of 2025, I mean, 2025 has really flown by. Perhaps we should incorporate 2026 as well. What are you expecting, or what are some things that you're sort of looking at for the remainder of this year, and then moving forwards into 2026?
Oh wow, there's a lot. I think some
Yeah,
of the
I thought there
things
would
that come,
be.
yeah, but some of the first things that come to mind are And we talked about tokenization, but there's the wrapper of digital assets. And so whether those are ETFs or basket products, a lot of those are coming. We're seeing the approvals in a variety of different markets. Um, I think the US is whether the government comes back and enables them all at once, or if they are sequenced out. The direction that we're seeing here is that there'll be a lot of ETFs that will enable whole new markets to allocate, right, to HBAR, to allocate to the technology stacks that they think will be prevailing in the future. And that's exciting because that's expanding the demand side of the equation. Um, then we've already seen the success of the MicroStrategies model in terms of DAT. So you know we're seeing those as just another vehicle by which there can be allocations to this industry. So it's coming in both ways, right? You're seeing the tokenization, and then you're seeing the intersection of traditional finance wrapping digital assets and enabling new ways for people to invest. And in many ways, that also reduces some of the friction as it relates to figuring out custody or otherwise. So it's just growing the market, growing the pie, and the pie is growing based off the user bases. It's great. It's growing based off of the use cases, and um, we talked a lot about AI today, but the pace at which AI is growing, the next trillion transactions, they're coming from AI. They are, and they're going to be agentic in nature. They're going to be machine to machine. I think we talked about Internet of Things like decades ago, and that was a buzzword. But device to device communications and trusting them is such an important component within global industry. And Hedera is leading on that front as well. And you see public companies like Wisely that are enabling secure communications between satellites and other devices, and so that is a huge source of where I expect there to be tremendous transaction volume, whether it's AI driven or whether it's device driven. Uh, you know, human to human will always be there, but it will become less and less the way that we interact because there will be this assistant that says that right now is just doing talk to me, right? We talk to LLMs, we talk to them via Twitter or the UIs for ChatGPT or Google AI or others, and they're moving in to do this for me, buy this for me, generate yield for me. That functionality is being laid. The team at Hashgraph and within the Hedera Foundation in terms of focusing on AI and the interoperability, the ELISA protocol, and other frameworks to facilitate this type of functionality. Those highways are being paved.
Yep. Yep. You talk about Hello Future. Like I say, I think that's so fitting with Hedera. I really do, because it really is Hello Future. It's here to enable that future that we're very clearly moving towards. And my brain kind of wobbles a little bit when I think about AI and agentic agents. And, you talk about things like booking a holiday, or we already have flight scanners and things like this. We've just booked flights to Europe for a conference. You can just potentially talk into your watch or your wearable, whatever it is, and all that's enabled, but it has to be able to transact. There's components of that DLTs solve to enable that future world. And I think all of this is super exciting. Gregg, the last thing for me to really do is to thank you very much for coming on the show. We absolutely need to get you back on because there's so much more to uncover. We've uncovered a hell of a lot, but there's so much more that Hedera is doing right now and really has to offer. So a massive thank you from behalf of myself and my community for coming on. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Likewise.